Welcome back, everyone, to the first video in the new Remaster line of videos. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Witch, but predominantly, I'm going to be talking about the changes to the Witch. Now, first, before I get into any of this, I do have to say thank you to Paizo for providing to me the player core and the GM's core in the game. It's actually, they're not paying. This video isn't necessarily sponsored. All they did was provide for me the books a little bit early, and so my opinions are completely my own. And as well, I'm just going to be talking mostly about what has changed, though any opinions I do have are of my own. So now that you know that, I will also state I will be redoing my series called Why This Class is Awesome to the remastered version after we're done with a lot of these videos. Mostly what I want to talk about today is, well, what changed and what can you expect from the new Witch in the remaster. I'll be doing this for each of the classes that are going to be showing up, and we'll probably have some auxiliary videos as well talking about some of the other changes coming with the remasters. So if you want to keep up to date with all the new stuff coming out with the remaster, I'm going to be releasing a video every day. So you're going to want to subscribe if you want to see that content, or more likely see it when it comes out. If you absolutely want to see it, you can join our Discord, linked in the description down below. But let's go ahead and talk about Witch. So Witch got the most changes of any of the other classes in the game, even though it might appear that Wizard got a huge rework. In all honesty, Wizard didn't change that much. A few tweaks here and there, but overall it plays mostly the same. Witch, on the other hand, got an overhaul is not really the right word I'd put for it. A Witch got some really nice tuning up, and as well, the class kind of got shifted a little bit from its general theme. When before the Witch was kind of like the wizard that could use any spell tradition, now the Witch is a class that can utilize familiars better than any other class, which I think is a really good push in the right direction. And they still have many of the same features, as we'll talk about here. So starting off, the Witch, up until the Feats, did not change. Well, not the Feats. Up until the Patrons did not change really all that much. The Witch still gets the same amount of hit points, still has the same weapon proficiencies, armor proficiencies, skill proficiencies, and the like. They're still an intelligence-based class, and as well, the Witch does have one new thing when it comes to their familiar, at least starting out, and that's the fact that each of the patrons gives the familiar a unique ability. Oh, actually, in addition to that as well, so normally when you started off as a Witch, you learn one focus spell in general that all witches knew, which was the Phase Familiar Hex, which acts the same in the remaster. When you use it, it's a reaction. Your familiar gains 5 resistance to all damage from the triggering attack, and it heightens at the same level of 2 damage per spell rank, which is the new spell level of spell rank, essentially. Now we actually have the option to get the Patron's Puppet Hex, which is really good. So the Patron's Puppet is a free action hex that they can use, similar to Cackle, where you spend a focus point, and you have to do this, though, when your turn begins, which I actually think also is with Hex. Actually, I can double check here real quick. No, actually, it's not on Hex, funny enough. But for Patron's Puppet, it must be when your turn begins. You can use a focus point, and it's a hex. Your familiar will then be commanded without needing to use any verbal or concentrate actions. So pretty much you can utilize your familiar without any cause of being concerned of triggering reactions, as your patron is controlling the familiar completely. Now, this actually is a huge hex, depending on if you take this one or the Phase Familiar. You only get to pick one, though. So it's whether you want to protect your familiar, or if you want the ability to maneuver your familiar much more easily. Commanding your familiar as a free action is actually insanely good, because not only is it essentially an action that replaces the command action. But you can see it as a free action that gives you 2 additional actions. Though they have to be done by your familiar, it's still pretty big. You can position your familiar, you can use one of the many familiar abilities, or some of the unique feats that we're going to talk about here in a bit. Now, it does cost you a focus point, but in all honesty, I still think it's pretty worth it, in my opinion. So, getting to the patrons, which is one of the biggest changes that the Witch got, most of the patrons are the same, but are expanded upon. Where before a patron was kind of given a vague theme based around an idea, like fervor, for instance, now we have Faith's Flamekeeper. There's a lot more narrative and a lot more RP stuff thrown into the patrons, which is really good. Most of them do act the same. Faith's Flamekeeper is the same as Fervor, except now it offers the new ability Familiar of Restored Spirit. What this ability does is your familiar gains a ability when you use a hex. This is how most of them work. Whenever you cast or sustain a hex, one willing creature within 15 feet of your familiar gains temporary hit points equal to 2 plus half your level, which lasts until the start of your next turn, not theirs. That's actually a pretty insane ability, just for the simple fact that if you're using your hexes anyway, you're just getting additional benefits. And now you want your familiar to be positioned better so that you can give this temp HP to someone, anyone, even yourself, if necessary. This is why Patron's Puppet is actually really good, because you can, as a free action, move your familiar, and when you do so, you are sustaining or casting a hex, more or less, which means that your familiar is going to be able to give that effect at the start of your turn, which is actually really good. And this is one of the things about Patron's Puppet that's really good, and why you might consider it over the Phase Familiar, there it is, because it allows you to essentially use your unique familiar effects at the beginning of your turn. I'll also say that temporary hit points 2 plus half your level is pretty good, honestly speaking. It's a pretty fair amount. It's going to be, it scales down as you level, unfortunately. In the beginning of the game, it's insanely good, giving you more than a strike's worth of damage typically, but as the game goes on, it'll be less and less. It's not terrible by any means, and is just honestly a pure benefit for using the Face Flamekeeper. But and to be fair, this is the only way you get divine spellcasting as a witch. So it's going to be a good ability no matter what, just because you get it for free. But this is what we can expect from the other patrons, which I will go over here, so you no need to worry. Next up is the Inscribed one, which replaces Rune. Now, it does mostly the same things, though it gives you Runic Weapon rather than Magic Weapon, as Magic Weapon has been replaced. But this is actually a pretty huge boon, because Runic Weapon is actually much better than Magic Weapon. So, Runic Weapon does mostly the same thing as Magic Weapon, only it now heightens. Now, it is the same touch, 2 actions, it masks for a minute, but when you initially use it, it gives it a +1 striking weapon effect and a +1 item to hit, same as potency. But at 6th level, it increases to +2 greater striking, and at a 9th level spell, it increases to a +3 major striking rune. At about the levels that you can more or less expect to find these, admittedly, because that's what, level 11, and I think +2 greater striking weapons are found 9 to 11, somewhere in that range, and 9th level is the same, being, I think, level 17, which is about the same time you find major striking. It's still an okay spell, but the benefit is now, because it heightens, this spell slot this one spell can be useful depending on where and what you use it on. Great for using on thrown weapons or the like. There's all kinds of situations where Runic Weapon is good, and honestly, it's just better than Magic Weapon in general. So, a general boon, though honestly, admittedly, a pretty niche use, unless your characters are just finding tons of weapons. This is a good way, though, to amp up a weapon, because paying for a major striking rune, for instance, is a lot of gold. And this might just be overall cheaper to do. So, in my opinion, Runic Weapon is still actually pretty valuable at higher slots for your martial players in your team. This is more of a support ability, not something that the Witch might use, but even if the Witch does, now you don't actually need to improve your own weapons as you scale through the game, allowing you to save your gold for much more needed, magic-related magic items. Now, the Inscribed one actually has one of the better familiar abilities, in my opinion, especially when you take the Patron's Puppet into consideration. You get the Familiar of Flowing script, and essentially what it does is whenever you cast or sustain a Hex, your familiar can now flank with you or your allies in combat. Now, this does make your familiar rather vulnerable, but the really good part about this is, at the start of your turn, you can position your familiar to flank with either you, giving you essentially a +2 to your strike on your turn, or to flank with an ally, giving off guard, making it more easy, and you just do this at the beginning of the turn. It's actually insanely good. Off guard is such a good situation for your team. It's honestly something. Now, it also treats your familiar, since they're tiny, as if they have a 5-foot reach, so they don't need to be in the enemy's square. And this does have the visual effect, though, so if the enemy is blind for whatever reason, they don't get this effect. But in most cases, this is a pretty solid benefit. And again, this is free whenever you use a Hex or sustain a Hex, which you're probably going to be doing because you're a witch, and there's not much better actions than using their hexes, even the hex cantrips, which are really good. Next up is Resentment, which replaces Hex. It's the same thing as Hex, does most of the same things, but the familiar ability for this one is that whenever you cast or sustain a Hex, your familiar curses a creature within 15 feet, extending any negative conditions it has that's affecting it by 1 round. Now, this only works on any condition that has a timed duration, such as 1 round or until the end of your next turn. This is really good for things like, for instance, Feints. Feints are something that will make an enemy flat-footed for a certain amount of time, off guard for a certain amount of time, and now this can extend that by 1 round, which is really good if you have a Swashbuckler on your team. But this doesn't work on things like the standard Frightened condition. Now, some Frightened conditions very rarely do have a number of rounds associated with them, but most of the time it's just the standard condition, which doesn't have a time duration, and instead the condition just drops by 1 state at the end of the character's turn. So it doesn't work on things like Frightened or Sickened or the like, unless they come with a duration. So something to keep in mind, but overall really good. This can be used in a lot of ways, especially if you have allies who are currently using the Feint or the Create a Distraction, which is also very, very handy. So, and 15 feet is actually pretty good. Another reason to make your familiars put out near the front line, though this does make them quite vulnerable. So it's just something to keep in mind. Overall, I'm really loving these changes. It really makes the Witch have so much more going on in their turn. I mean, even just with what we looked at, not even looking at the feats, now your Witch is not only doing the things that they were already doing, casting spells, casting hexes, or the like, but they're also either giving benefits to their teammates or cursing their enemies, just extra. It's just bonus stuff. It's honestly such a huge improvement. Next up is Silence in Snow, which does the same thing as the Winter Patron theme did. This one comes with the familiar of Freezing Rime, and you can see them here on screen, but if they do anything differently, like giving you different access to spells or the like, I will make a mention of it. Most of the spells that are mentioned here might have a different name, but if they do the same thing, then if they do the same thing, I won't mention it, but if they do something different, I will make mention of it. Anyway, so Silence in Snow gives you your familiar the Freezing Rime ability, and this one's actually really good for a variety of reasons. So whenever you cast or sustain a Hex, your familiar creates an icy burst, 5-foot burst on the ground that creates difficult terrain. Now, what I actually really like about this one is it actually synergizes really well with Geomancer. If you're playing the true Ice Witch, even if your familiar is staying in your square, you're constantly creating difficult terrain around you, which makes it harder for enemies to approach you. It does make it more difficult for you to move, but if you don't plan on moving, you can especially use this with the Geomancer's abilities, who can amplify your cold spells. It's a really cool archetype kind of class synergy that I think is really, really awesome. And again, it's just a free ability whenever you're using a hex on your turn. I thoroughly enjoy this one, and there's also lots of ways to get to remove the difficulty of moving through snow and ice. I think even Geomancer provides some of that stuff anyway, meaning that you don't even get nerfed for the extra difficult terrain that you're creating. And a 5-foot burst is actually pretty substantial, all things considered. So more or less, Silence and Snow is actually really good and creates some very interesting synergies. Next up is Spinner of Threads. This replaces the Fate Patron. Again, replaces. Mostly does the same thing. This one says Shore Strike. It's the same as True Strike. They just had to change it for, legal reasons. And this one gives the familiar the Balanced Luck. It's a very interesting. What it does is whenever you cast or sustain a hex, one creature within 15 feet of your familiar gets a choice of either a +1 status bonus to its AC or a -1 status penalty to its AC until the start of your next turn. Sorry, not the creature. You can choose one creature that either gets a bonus to their AC or a penalty to their AC. Because it's status, this is actually insanely good, because something like Off Guard provides a circumstance penalty to an enemy's AC. That being the case, this can give with if you're flanking an enemy with your ally and you use something like this ability, not only are you providing them the standard Off Guard benefit, but also the minus to their AC, making a -3, making this particularly really good for frontline witches. Though obviously a lot of people have an issue with that. I don't think it's a big deal. There's lots of ways you can make classes upfront classes in the game. In any regard, really good. And even if you're not, flanking with an ally, this benefit just works in general, because again, you're already using a hex anyway. You might as well just reduce the enemy's AC as a part of it as well. If anything, you can consider as you're just reducing an enemy's AC in addition to the other benefits of your hex, which is actually pretty insane. Starless Shadow is the one that is replacing Night, and it actually is a bit more different than it was before. Now, rather than providing the sleep cantrip, this one provides the sleep spell. This one provides the fear spell, which in my opinion is overall better, as sleep has some problems when working in combat. It's overall a very complex spell. Fear is just always good and honestly just simpler. So probably the reason why they decided to change it, and I thoroughly like it. Now, this one gives your familiar the Stalking Night ability, and so whenever you cast or sustain a hex, if your familiar is adjacent to an enemy and it is currently concealed, hidden, or undetected, the enemy becomes frightened. Most familiars are trained in stealth, so this actually works out pretty well. And your familiar will use your intelligence modifier for its stealth, which is insanely good. Another reason why you want to invest in your familiar's abilities, this ability is overall a bit weaker in my opinion, but that's because the frightened condition is so good, because it does require that your familiar is at least concealed, which unless they're in tall grass or there's something, because the familiar must be both adjacent and concealed. There's ways around this. The Shadow Familiar can be particularly good at this one, so there are ways, but this makes your familiar more vulnerable because it needs to be adjacent to an enemy, and it must either be using, some kind of stealth or hide, or must be invisible in some variety. Really good for specific familiars if you're using an imp or a quasit, which I think give you invisibility. But other than that, it is something that, for the stronger effect of Frightened, just seems harder to get off overall. Regardless, it's good, and as I mentioned before, this is in addition to when you would normally use your actions anyway, so even if you're not benefiting from this every turn, it's still not half bad. And the last one is Wilding Steward, which, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, is wild. Or being sarcastic. Anyway, so this one does mostly the same things as it did before, giving you access to either Summon Plant or Summon Fungus. In any regard, this one gives you your familiar the Keen Senses ability, so that whenever you use cast a hex or sustain a hex, your familiar gains an imprecise scent, tremor sense, or wave sense with a range of 60 feet, which is insane, and it can point out as a free action, meaning that you at least always know the location of typically hidden, even undetected enemies, as long as they're within this range, and of course the sense applies. Tremor sense is going to be huge for this part in general, as long as your familiar is, on the ground. This one's overall really good and honestly very helpful, but much more niche than many of the other abilities, as there's not often times that you're dealing with enemies who are necessarily invisible. Great for when a mage is trying to run away, though. So I really do like this one. It just feels like it doesn't get off nearly as much as some of the other ones does. And regardless, if you enjoy Wild, you're going to enjoy using Keen Senses, I bet. And that's the changes to the patrons. Now, there are some feats that have been changed as well, and we're going to go over those. But, we've gotten through the video at this point, and I'm just going to leave a quick reminder. Like the video if you enjoy this, just so other people get to see this content as it's coming out, and as well, subscribe if you want to see more content like this. All right, now, I'm not going to be going over all the feats that they got in the remaster, mostly because most of them are the same. I'm only going to be mentioning some of the changes. And actually, speaking of changes, the first one we're going to be talking about is actually Cauldron. Cauldron got a small change, but it's actually pretty huge when you take it into consideration. No longer does Cauldron give you additional batches or additional amounts when you make batches of oils or potions. Before, Cauldron would give you 6 whenever you make a batch rather than 4. Now, Cauldron gives you essentially the same ability as the, what was it called? Temporary potions, where at the beginning of your day, you gain a oil or potion that you can make, and when you heighten up in your spell proficiency, well, let me read it here. So, when you start off with this feat at level 1, you can make 1 additional temporary oil or potion using a formula you know. If you gain Master Proficiency, which is I think around level 13, you gain 2 batches, and when you get Legendary Proficiency, you gain 3 batches of, batches. You gain 3 of these items that you can create. Now, overall, it has the same abilities essentially as Advanced Alchemy does, where you can't stock up on them. At the end of the day, they just become inert. But what I like about this one is, 1, it removes the need to take a later feat, but 2, it gives you an immediate benefit. Getting essentially Advanced Alchemy for a potion or oil at level 1 is really, really good. The best part is it doesn't have the normal problem that other classes have with Advanced Alchemy, where they don't have a high level. This is any that you have a formula for that is of a level that you can craft. So you don't even get that normal penalty to it. Insanely good, and I love the fact that they combine these 2 abilities. It just makes Cauldron feel a lot better taking at level 1, because now not only are you gaining additional alchemy as you level, but, not even alchemy. It's magical crafting, because it's oils and potions, which are magical and not alchemical. But you also get that free one every day, which I think is actually a pretty good buff. Now, that does mean, though, that your downtime crafting gets a bit nerfed, but crafting rules did change. I will be actually making a video on that, going over all the new crafting stuff in the game. So be on the lookout for that. But overall, I do consider this one mostly a buff. Now, a very interesting change, but they've now removed Wart Witch from the Witch's feat. So you no longer are able to gain a Leshy familiar. I don't know exactly how I feel about this one. It does make the Druid's familiar feel like the plant order Druid, or leaf order, I think, Druid feel much better, I guess, because Witch doesn't steal the familiar. But at the same time, it does feel kind of unfortunate that the Witch loses access to a unique familiar feat at level 1. I guess a small price to pay for how much cooler the Witch's familiars are now, but a very strange change in all honesty. Again, I guess it's just to keep the uniqueness of the Leshy familiar to the Druid, which I can completely understand. And honestly, Witch's familiars are better now. Witches also gain a new feat starting at level 1, which is Witch's Armaments, which replaces both Living Hair and Eldritch Nails and gives you a new unique one called Iron Teeth. So essentially what this feat does is you gain one unique type of unarmed attack. You either get nails that do a d6 slashing damage, are brawling, and are agile. You get Iron Teeth, which is a jaw attack, which is a d8 and is also in the brawling group. Or you get your Living Hair, which does a d4 bludgeoning damage, but has agile, disarm, finesse, trip, but not reach unarmed traits. Which, honestly, Living Hair now feels like the better choice. I was a big fan of the prior Eldritch Nails. I liked having a unique set of runes for essentially my unarmed strikes that I could switch between either my hand wraps or my nails. That is no longer a thing, which is very unfortunate. I actually dislike that change more than anything. Now, I'm sure many of you are going to be upset because, again, why are witches using, any kind of attack, unarmed strike, or whatever? There are plenty of builds that utilized it, and if you don't like that feat, that's completely fine. The best part about this feat is, 1, you get these feats at level 1 rather than later level, and 2, you can actually select this feat multiple times if you want multiple different kinds of attacks. This is good for certain ways, and it does synergize with later feats that they gain access to, but again, if you're not into witches using any kind of unarmed strike, then this feat's not going to be for you. It's not my fault you don't see the value in it, but I can guarantee for those who do see it, this is not a bad change at all. Again, I do miss Eldritch Nails' kind of ability. Also, they kind of lose their spell strike ability with hexes, which I do find kind of bad, but again, this now evolves later with later feats. So Witch's Armaments, overall, I'm kind of neutral on, but I think it's kind of cool at the very least. Now, all the way up here at level 4, they lost access to the Improved Familiar, which I find is very strange. Improved Familiar was one of those feats that made it more likely to gain access to a unique familiar. I don't know why they removed this. It's very strange. But yeah, witches no longer have access to improved familiar. So I don't know. I don't know what the main purpose for that was. They still get access to, if you're curious, they still get access to enhanced familiar and incredible familiar and they just don't have access to improved familiar, which just made it easier to gain access to specific familiars. So I don't know why that was changed, and they might re-add it later with a book that adds more on familiars. We'll also look a little bit at familiars a little later, but overall, it's just a very strange change in my opinion. Now, at level 4, also, we got Sympathetic Strike, which is one of those feats I mentioned before that scales off of Witch's Armaments. So essentially, once per round, you can make a strike with one of your Witch's Armaments, one of your unarmed strikes, and if you hit, the target is now afflicted, making them easier to curse, giving them a -1 circumstance penalty to their saves against your hexes. Now, what I like about this is because it's circumstance to a save, this does stack with things like Frightened, because Frightened does status to saves typically. So that being the case, there are some really good ways that you can make some enemies much, much more likely to critically fail your hexes. And if you crit strike them with this unarmed attack, the penalty is -2. Now, this is really good when you combine it with the not night familiar. The familiar that gives you, or that extends the duration of an enemy's current affliction whenever you use a hex. So you use Sympathetic Strike, you make them weak, then you hex the enemy, and when the enemy is hexed, you also give them their penalty for an additional round, and you can sustain that for the rest of combat as long as you're sustaining the current hex on them or even using other hexes during your turns. So the Sympathetic Strike is actually insanely good when used with the resentments, the ongoing misery from the resentment patron. That familiar ability stacks insanely good with this particular feat. All right, another new feat at level 6, and one I think is insanely powerful, is Ceremonial Knife. Now, some of you probably already know about this one because it was leaked prior to this by the devs. But essentially what it does is during your daily preparations, you can perform a short ritual over a weapon that's in the dagger group that causes it to function like a magic wand, containing any first rank spell that you have or that your familiar knows. Now, only you can activate this wand, which is, understandable, and you can still overcharging it, though this can break or even destroy the knife that's being used. Now, at every even level after this, the maximum spell rank you can put into this increases by 1, which makes it, I think, at this point, it's going to be 2 under your max. So it gets up to an 8th level spell at level 20, give or take, which is insanely good. Now, what I like about this one is daggers and such are insanely cheap in the game, meaning that you have access to essentially a wand every day that you're not afraid to overcharge to break or even destroy. That being the case, Ceremonial Knife is insanely powerful, giving you a wand every day that's going to use spells 2 under your highest spell level, and that's just insanely good. It's an insanely powerful ability just because it gives you essentially 2 extra spell slots. As long as you're willing to buy a bunch of daggers, this is actually an insane and really good ability. All right, at level 8, we gain 2 unique familiar abilities, which is really cool. Now you either get Spirit Familiar, which requires a Divine or Occult Patron, or Stitched Familiar, which uses Arcane or Primal. Talking first about Spirit Familiar, your familiar gains a new ability it can use on when you command it. So when you command your familiar once per 10 minutes, your familiar's spirit exits its body and flies into the nearest enemy within 20 feet, dealing 6d6 spirit damage. If you're unfamiliar with spirit damage, it's essentially replacing alignment damage and works pretty much on any creature that has a soul or spirit of any kind, even astral projections, which is insanely good. Now, the target does get a basic will save against this damage, but it's essentially a fireball that the enemy gets that instead uses will save. It's insanely good, and if the familiar dealt damage to the enemy in any way, an ally within 30 feet of the enemy restores HP equal to half the damage dealt. Your familiar then reforms into its original square, and at 9th level and every odd level after that, the damage increases by 2d6, essentially heightening. This is a spirit form of fireball that goes off of will saves and has a vampiric effect on top of it, giving an ally, which it's only an ally to your familiar, which counts, which means you yourself count in this situation, can gain half the damage dealt, which is actually insanely good. Now, of course, this does make your familiar then a big target, and you can only use this once per 10 minutes, so most of the time, once per combat, give or take, unless you're having multiple combats in a 10-minute spree, which, can happen. In any regard, this is an insanely powerful ability, really, really cool, and essentially just gives Witch a much better fireball, which I think is really cool. Oh, and on top of that, before I move on, it's once per 10 minutes. It doesn't use a spell slot. So essentially, you get a fireball that you can use once every 10 minutes. That's insanely good. Then we got Stitched Familiar for Arcane and Primal. Now, this one is similar. Once per 10 minutes, you essentially get a different fireball. This one, your familiar unravels into magical fibers, striking an enemy within 30 feet, dealing 6d6 slashing damage on a basic reflex saving throw. And on a failure, the target isn't immobilized for 1 round or until it escapes against your spell DC. Now, when this one also, your familiar reforms and does more damage as you level up. So essentially, this is a slashing fireball that also gets the ability to immobilize an enemy for a round when you, or if they fail the check. The one thing I'm kind of sad about is that it doesn't work with the Occult Patron, so you can't use that one familiar that can actually make the enemy perpetually immobilized, which would be broken, understandably. But still, if there's another witch in your party, they can perpetually immobilize the enemy by using hexes, which I think is broken. Granted, the enemy can at least escape from this, completely ending the effect. But I do love the idea of 2 witches acting together to keep enemies rooted in place, forcing them to expend actions to escape. It's just a really fun combination. It makes Stitched Familiar really cool. And again, Now, I am aware that both of these abilities are technically a little bit worse than a fireball because they would be 4th level spells by this feat level, but they don't use spell slots. So, and I didn't say a heightens fireball, I just said a fireball. So even though they do technically at any level 2d6 less than a fireball of the same heightened ability, they're free fireballs of level 3. Even if they didn't increase in damage, that would be insanely good. But they also increase in damage, which is insanely good. So overall, both of these feats are insane, which is really, really cool now. Now at 10th level, we get double. Now this does replace temporary potions. And well, I said before that the benefit of Cauldron is now it essentially uses the benefits of 2 feats, both at level 1. What double does is if you are enjoying the benefits, you get extra potions. So essentially, during your daily preparations, you prepare 2 copies of the item, and when you become master, you get 4, and legendary, you get 6, which I think overall makes it more than you would have gotten from temporary potions anyway. So double just is a better version of temporary potions, and you only need to pick it up if honestly you want extra oils or potions. Oils are insanely good, so are potions. So I can definitely see picking this one up, but even if you don't, Cauldron is still insanely good. So double just enhances what's already a really good feat. Next up at level 12, we got Coven Spell, a new reaction that you gain, and it's a reaction spell shape. So essentially, if you're not familiar with spell shapes, they're the new meta magics that got name changed into the remaster. But when an ally within 30 feet casts a spell, you can use your reaction to do one of 2 benefits. Either one, if the spell deals damage that doesn't have a duration, you grant that spell a status bonus to its damage equal to its rank, which is insanely good. Or if that spell doesn't have a spell shape effect applied to it, apply the effects of any one spell shape you know to the spell. The spell shape must be one that can be applied to the triggering spell, and you must be able to use it. For instance, if the spell shape feat is usable only a limited number of times per day, so you can do this. This is actually insanely good, and it creates really good synergy, and it gives Witch an insanely good reaction for a class that normally doesn't have any reactions. So overall, Coven Spell is insanely good because, I mean, you do need to be within 30 feet of the casting ally, but that's not insanely hard, and you just amplify their spell when you're casting it. And there's actually nothing in here saying like a sorcerer, for instance, who's using a spell who normally gets bonus damage to certain types of spells they use. This can stack on top of it, which is, well, depending if they're status bonus damage equal, if they're both status bonuses or not. But if they're not, then that's really good. I really like this one, and it's a really, really good reaction if you have other spellcasters on your team. A very solid pickup, in my opinion. Hex Focus did get a change as well. Not only now does it just completely refill all your focus points when you're downtime rather than 2, which is insanely good, but now there's also not the other Hex Wellspring at level 18, which you needed to get all your focus points back. So overall, a general improvement. This is something that they mentioned before as well. So anytime a class, especially one that uses focus points specific or as a major class feature, now you just have a level 12 feat typically. That's just going to give you all your focus points back. And if you're not familiar with the new changes, well, focus points are no longer as limited as they were before. Anytime you use focus points now, you can spend 10 minutes to restore a focus point up to your max, and you can do this as many times in a row as you want, getting up to your max, which is 3, without needing to spend focus points or whatever. Before, it was like if you spent 2 focus points, you could only recover 1 of them back. Now you can just get up to your max if you have enough time to sit and rest in between fights or whatever. Hex Focus is insanely good because now the minimum downtime you need is only 10 minutes rather than 30 minutes, which it would have been without it. So a good feat if you're interested in using a lot of your focus points, or if you use more than 1 focus point per battle. Insanely good just to keep the ball rolling and to make it easier on your team without needing to sit down for 30 minutes after every battle. So I really do like this change in general, and it makes focus points very easy to use. Level 12 just coming out with bangers, coming out with another new feat. This one is Witch's Broom. And essentially, you take any kind of broom, staff, polearm, any kind of pole you can find, essentially, any pole-shaped object, which I find funny, and you anoint it during your daily preparations. It gains the magical trait, and you can ride it as long as you're holding on to it with at least one hand. It has a move speed of a fly speed of 20 feet, and the broom takes a -10 penalty to its speed if you have more than 20 bulk, and it can't get off the ground. If you have 30 bulk or more, shouldn't be a problem more often than not, but this is just mostly just for if you're trying to carry someone along with you, more or less. Now, the broom can't be controlled by anyone else, only you can use it to fly. And if you anoint a weapon like a polearm in this way, you can't ride it and wield it at the same time. So that would be cool. Honestly, I'm sad that they removed that, but yeah, I guess it makes sense in any regard. A very interesting feat, and if you can now craft a broomstick into a flying broomstick as though you had the formula. So essentially, this also comes with a formula for a flying broomstick, and when you do, if you're using this effect on a already flying broomstick, you actually give it a status bonus to its speed of +10, which is insanely good. So Witch's Broom is actually a very, very solid flight feat that you can get pretty early. It's not super fast, but if you spend any downtime crafting a flying broom, it makes a very, very fast method of flight that you only need one hand to utilize. So overall, Witch's Broom, an insanely good feat. Another strange change to level 12, there's no longer the Familiar's Eyes feat. I honestly don't know why. So you no longer have access to Familiar's Eyes, which if you're unfamiliar with it, it essentially allowed you to project your senses into your familiar, going limp, but your familiar can go and do things, and you can telepathically communicate with your familiar. I don't know why this was removed. It seems kind of like a weird debuff in a sense. Maybe they changed the rules for familiars, but I didn't see it. So if they did let me know in the comments below if you have access to the core or the player core. Regardless, a very strange loss for Witch, and one I'm kind of sad about because I really do like scouting with familiars. I think it's one of the best utilities of a familiar, and this was just a better way to make that scouting ability even better for you and your team. But yeah, just removed from Witch for some reason. I don't know why. All right, at level 14, we gained access to Patron's Presence, which was one, I think that was also spoiled by the development team. A very, very cool one. It gives your familiar a new ability. It can be used when you command it. Now, once per hour, your familiar can, well, your patron anyway, can once per hour act through your familiar when you command your familiar to do so. It creates a 15-foot emanation and aura effect that when an enemy starts their turn within their aura, they need to make a will save against your spell DC or become stupefied 2 for as long as they remain within the aura, or stupefied 3 on a critical failure. The aura lasts until the end of your next turn, but the familiar can sustain it up to a minute, meaning you'll need to command your familiar, which will then use one of its actions to sustain. Overall, this is a very interesting one. I do like this, and Stupefied is huge because it reduces will saves, meaning that you're more than likely to get crits on your hexes and the like. Essentially a better version of the one hex that, or the one familiar ability that makes it easier to hex in it. Oh, no. It's the Witch's Armament one, which is Sympathetic Strike. A better version of Sympathetic Strike that makes it reliant on you hitting an enemy to reduce the enemy's saves against your spell. Now this is just an aura from your familiar. But the weird part about this is it's not when the enemy enters into the familiar's aura for the first time, and it's only while they're in the aura. So if an enemy starts their turn within the aura and then gets the debuff, they need to move out, and they can very easily do so because it's only a 15-foot emanation to, then no longer be stupefied. Now, Stupefy, I do believe, also makes it no, I think that's Fascinated. Yeah, I don't know. This one's actually not as good as it kind of looks, in my opinion, honestly. I mean, don't get me wrong, stacking debuffs, Stupefied, all that kind of stuff is, and I do believe the Sympathetic Strike creates a circumstance penalty, so they can stack, but it relies on your enemy not only starting their turn, but choosing to either not mark your familiar right there, and also not move out of the aura to keep the stupefied condition. I don't know. I don't know exactly how I feel about this one in particular. It's something that I feel like is really good for forcing enemies out of an area, or maybe an enemy is doing something really important and might choose to stay in the aura because it's like, stupefied. I don't use my intelligence for anything anyway. I don't know. Patron's presence is very interesting. I really like the idea behind it, but I feel like in practice, it's just something that you're not going to get the actual effect of, and more of this is just a zoning tool that you can use to keep enemies out of specific areas. Which, I mean, if an enemy is trying to attack you, your familiar, and this only affects enemies, your familiar that's on you can just create an aura that makes it so that they don't want to mess with your character, which in that case, it's actually a pretty good defensive tool. So overall, Patron's presence is pretty okay. I think it's good. I like it. It has some interesting uses, but I do think that using it offensively can be somewhat difficult. And at level 18, as I already mentioned before, they removed Hex Wellspring, essentially just making it the Hex focus is now the feat for everything. And they added Patron's Claim, an insanely good ability, and this is another ability that your familiar gets. Once per hour, your familiar's mouth opens impossibly wide as your patron's grasping limb or limbs reaches through the orifice towards a creature within 30 feet, dealing 10d10 spirit damage with a basic fortitude saving throw against your spell DC. If the creature fails its save and takes damage, so it does need to actually take the damage from this, so it can't work on constructs, even though, like technically they could be targeted. They do need to be able to take damage, so it doesn't work on constructs at all. If the creature does take damage from this, they also drain 2, which is going to do twice their level in damage to them, and cap their health down by that same amount, which is insane. Or drain 4 on a critical failure. You also regain a focus point when you do this up to your usual maximum, which is pretty cool, honestly. Oh, insanely good ability, and something that I think makes this really worth taking. Once per hour, being able to regain a focus point in combat, do 10d10 spirit damage, and drain an enemy, all with a singular. This is all from a singular action from you, because your familiar gains this ability. So yeah, it's insanely good. All right, so I did mention that we were going to look at familiars, and honestly, nothing really changed with familiars. The only thing that I'm going to make special mention of is I did mention before how it was strange how Witch didn't have improved familiar. And I think that's because that was something that was introduced, the specific familiars, in the advanced player's guide. So I'm assuming Witch is going to pick up that feat when the player core 2 drops, or maybe another book down the line, because there are no specific familiars added in Player Core 1. There wasn't in the original core book release. Most of the abilities are the same. The only thing I could say is that they've added some of the abilities that were added in the Advanced Player's Guide into Core 1 now. So overall, that is the Witch. Now, this video has been going on for almost an hour in recording. I'm sure it's been cut down quite a bit. But this is the most extensive a class has been changed. And mostly it's just because of the rework with how familiars work, which now wants to use familiar, which I think is insanely good. Something that is super fun and honestly changes their playstyle, which got a lot of really good buffs in general. Some weird downgrades, and I think some of that is mostly just due to the fact that it was either conflicting with like the rule set, like I said, improved familiar being removed. That's probably because there's just no specific familiars in this book. In these books, this player core is replacing the core book for the new line for new players. So it wouldn't make sense to mention an ability that isn't mentioned, or mention like a specific familiar type that's not mentioned at all within the book. And as well, I feel like Witch just has done better to differentiate itself from it's from other classes. I feel it's much more unique. And honestly, the general patron abilities that your familiars get access to now are insanely good, giving witches essentially consistent extra spell slots that don't consume spell slots that only cost one action to utilize because it's your patron or your familiar using the activity, which I think is insanely good. So let me know your thoughts down below in the comment. Do you like New Witch or do you prefer the old way it was before? Hopefully you enjoyed the video, but that's going to be it for me. My voice is getting sore from this one. So thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And stay tuned because every day this week and probably next week, we're going to be having videos coming out on the new remaster content. So I'll see y'all then. Bye.